Good afternoon. I'm Andrew Guthrie with Haynes and Boone in Dallas, and I'm here today with Justice Larry Myers of the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. Judge, I appreciate you being here with us today.
Oh, I'm quite honored. So
Well,
thank you for inviting me.
thanks for letting us hear your stories of your practice and your time on the bench. So I guess we'll just start right at the beginning.
Sure.
What was it that made you decide you wanted to become a lawyer? When was that?
Always, I guess, about halfway through college. I'd taken a lot of science courses, thinking I was going to go maybe to medical school, but then took a number of other courses. And then at the end, when I was at SMU, I just decided I was going to I'd rather go to law school, and went ahead and took the LSAT and did that.
So you went to University of Kansas for law school, came out and worked as a district attorney for a few years,
And then worked for a judge, and then was an assistant district attorney.
And what was that clerkship like?
It was great. I was a judge in Kansas City.
Okay.
Enjoyed that and stuff.
And then I know you went into private practice in Fort Worth for a dozen or so years. What was the nature of your practice?
Well, it was kind of general. I did a lot of everything. I did a lot of domestic relations. I did some straight out civil litigation. I did some criminal defense and did probate. So I did a little bit of everything, and it was just I'd been with some lawyers before, but at the end I was just on my own.
And so talk about those mentors that you had. Mentors guiding you early on in your career. What did they kind of instill in you?
Well, I mean, I don't know if mentors is really the exact phraseology I would use. There were a lot of good lawyers that I looked up to, and some of them were very generous in helping me out in my practice, and a lot of them I wound up going up against in my practice, and learned a lot from the way they handled their case or our case, and it was just a number of different lawyers that I liked, both mainly in Fort Worth, or a few in Dallas and stuff. But it was a number of different lawyers and stuff.
Well, with that variety of a practice, are there memorable cases that stand out, whether for good reasons, for bad reasons?
Yeah, there are, and everything. Probably not going to get really into specifics, but some of them are fairly. Yes, some of them are very. Some of them were real hard. Some of them had some interesting sidelights to them. Others had, interesting clients to it, and everything. And so, I can remember some of those cases. That, in fact, some of those cases actually, when I got on the Court of Appeals later on, wound up coming in front of me as far as having to decide the validity of some of those cases. Not that I participated in those cases, but just saw them come up to the Court of Appeals when I was there.
Now, did you do appellate work in your private practice?
I did a few appeals and everything, so I was familiar with all that.
Okay, so let's talk about the transition to the bench. You joined the Second Court of Appeals in Fort Worth in 1989. Can you just talk about what that transition was like? Where did it come from?
Well, it was a situation. I thought that's what I would like to do was be an appellate judge. I ran for it. The party I was running from had never been elected to that court, and then that happened to be in the '88 election. Happened to be the first time that was done, and so me and another gentleman we went on there as the first from our party to be on there, and I got on the court with some very other outstanding judges. And they were very helpful to me as far as getting me transitioned to be an appellate judge, and I'm very grateful to their hospitality and efforts to help me over the 4 years I was on that court. So that's and it was a general it was a court that had almost been a decade into handling both criminal and civil situations, so they'd gotten pretty accomplished handling both, and it was quite interesting, and enjoyed that, and enjoyed all the lawyers that were part of that court too, because all appellate courts have a staff that are very good, and they were always very helpful and nice to me.
And talk a little bit about that early learning process of how you learned to become an appellate judge. I mean, what was that like? What was hard for you? What came naturally?
What came naturally was my interest in trying to do the right thing, and so it was a situation. Unfortunately, you're elected to these courts, and so there's always political pressure on you and everything. But going to try to avoid all that, and the judges on that I was serving with were very I had that same attitude and everything, and so it was just a matter of trying to get to the bottom of the essence of what the case was about, and then also try to be not so much expansive, but be as open-minded as you could, because there was always new law coming from higher courts and stuff, and so we always wanted to be aware of that, and didn't necessarily just always wanted to rubber stamp an opinion one way or the other. I always felt that because the advocates usually were fairly aggressive in trying to look at all new existing aspects and new aspects to that particular point of law. So I was going to do the same.
And I think you mentioned earlier that you'd always kind of thought about becoming an appellate judge. So you decided to run for it. What was it about that job that sort of attracted you to that made you want to run for that
well,
position?
Probably didn't have the disposition to be as good a trial judge as a lot of other folks have been and everything. And so I just I always like the research and the writing part of it, and so that's what interested me more. Plus, you were able to delve into newer aspects that you didn't quite have that freedom to do from the trial bench.
And I don't want to know about specifics here, but just talk generally about the relationships on the Court of Appeals, of learning how to work with other judges and persuade them to sit on 3-judge panels and decide this case together.
I was fortunate, and I'm presuming maybe this is the same way with all the courts of appeals, but I was fortunate. The court I sat with it was a 7-member court, and so we rotated with different members all the time. But I was very fortunate. Every member I sat with they were smart, hardworking, and very generous in their time and their expertise in helping me, and so I'm still great. I keep in touch with some of them still to this day, and it was just they went out of their way to try to be helpful to me, and that's what I'm appreciative of, and then hopefully I'll return that by working hard and being fair.
When you sat on the Court of Appeals and you were handling both civil matters and criminal matters, other than just kind of the straight up substantive differences between those areas, did you feel like there were differences between the way those cases were argued? Can you talk about that?
What I liked was what was neat was able to I thought some of the aspects of one that people should just not be mired in their one specialty of either criminal or civil, that there are advantages to both of them one certain aspects of one could be advantageous in the other and stuff, and so I always tried to emphasize that to a lot of the litigants in front of us and everything, and fortunately some of them did understand what I was getting at, and I think it helped both ways.
I'm curious about that. Can you give a specific example of what a criminal lawyer does well in a civil case, or vice versa?
Well, Adrian, as you well know, you're a civil lawyer, and so your cases are always your pleadings are so important in all that, basically, and then you have all that discovery and everything, and then in the criminal you don't have all that. You just have your indictment, and then you're really just dealing with anything that is actually reduced to writing later on, just the charge and things of that nature. But that's why. But I've tried to emphasize to some of the criminal lawyers that even though you're just dealing with the indictment, you need to be aware of all aspects of what the state is trying to put on and everything, and then in relation to the civil guys to the criminal, that the criminal guys are very much more active as far as dealing with pushing the judge for certain issues and situations, and then also their way of the way they would handle juries and things of nature. I always thought that those particular aspects of a criminal guy would help the civil folks too.
And then in 1992, you did join a court that does exclusively criminal
Right.
law. You joined the Court of Criminal Appeals. So talk us through where that desire to run for a higher office came from.
Well, I always like criminal situations, and I just thought that might be a way to go. And once again, nobody in my party had ever been elected to that court. It was more of a situation. I just thought I would see what I could do, and fortunately, I was the first one from my party elected to there. And once again, I came upon all the rest of the 8 judges on the court were of the other party, but they were all very, very hospitable and very helpful, and I'm eternally grateful to them. I just talked to one of my former colleagues from that time yesterday, and it was really neat to be able to specialize and to go much deeper into that particular specialty than you are able to do at the Court of Appeals, and it's just because of the natures of the courts.
And I was going to ask what the kind of the initial differences you noticed between the two courts. Is it just that? Is it that you really do specialize in criminal law, or were there other differences between?
Well, the appeal at the Court of Appeals is a general appeal. It deals with multiple points of error, and then by the time it comes to us on appeal from the Courts of Appeals, it deals only with what the Court of Appeals dealt with, those specific points, and usually it's reduced down to 1 or 2 of those points, and so you can be much more you can delve in much deeper into that question than was dealt at the Court of Appeals, and once again, our court is the final arbiter of these questions, so it's kind of neat to do that.
So it's maybe more of a rifle shot appeal that you deal with than kind of a scatter shot general
exactly.
appeal.
You, instead of a shotgun, you went more to a rifle.
Yeah. Now, maybe that's a easier part of dealing with things on the Court of Criminal Appeals. What's the most difficult part of sitting on the Court of Criminal Appeals and having to decide these big criminal cases?
Well, I think sometimes it's the outside pressures that you have both politically and maybe also from just the community itself and everything that people aren't necessarily always as attuned to how the Constitution and constitutional rights are to be implemented and stuff, and so there's a lot of pressure to sometimes overlook that, and so it's that's to me the hardest part is that you really you can't do anything that that should be that is done just out of popularity or in order to satisfy certain political wants and needs. You've got to be vigilant to the law and the Constitution.
Now you've sat on the Court of Criminal Appeals since 1992. Have you seen changes in the practice of the law, and kind of what are some of the big changes in practice of law you've seen?
Well, I've just seen in our court. I've seen it kind of rotate 2 or 3 different times from different aspects. Just in that, a lot of that's just based upon the turnover based upon who's on the court and everything. And so I've seen a lot of judges come and go. This is my 23rd year of being on the court, so I've been there a long time and everything. But within the first 6 years of my practice, of my sitting on the court, I went from being the most junior judge on the court to the senior judge, and I've been the senior judge now for about 17, 18 years, and so so I've seen a lot of people come and go, and a lot of people, and a lot of them have fairly definitive ideas of how the law should be done, and a lot of them some of them were very bright, and I hate to see some of them retire and leave and stuff, and then we've had being right there next to as you know, Andrew, having clerked at the court, you're right there next to the legislature, so a lot of the stuff you do it has the attention of the legislature and stuff, and so it's really interesting that you're really under a microscope there as to nearly everything you do.
Now, as the dynamics of the court change, as people come and go, do you find the dynamics of your personal practice change, whether you spend more time going in somebody's office and arguing with them, or spending more time writing memos or writing drafts?
Sometimes personalities dictate, you go visit them more, or that you since I'm a senior judge, whether I summon them down to come down to my office, and we'll talk about and everything. And the court doesn't necessarily have cliques, but they have certain judges that usually they kind of look at cases in a similar way a lot of times and everything. So one of the most interesting things I do remember on the court was a case we had one time. I think it dealt with an arrest of a woman who turned out to be kind of a soccer mom, but it was some kind of they used as you may know, that there's in order to stop a car, you just have to have reasonable suspicion that you violated some traffic ordinance or some other kind of law, and they stopped this woman based upon the fact that her license plate, there was a statute at that time indicating that you could not, that the cover around the license plate could not be too broad, that it covered up any of the logo of the state or the identifying of the state or the renewal stickers or any of the numbers and stuff, and that would have been a violation and stuff. And so I remember when we were dealing with that case, it wound up being that I was the only one that had descended to that particular case, being that was a valid statute in order to precipitate a stop based upon reasonable suspicion of crime. And so, but the legislature happened to be in session at that time, and it went out, and I was the only one that dissented, and so the legislature, they were the ones that had passed that law and stuff. And so I remember when that happened, that just all these news crews and cameras descended on the Capitol, and we're out there filming all the members' license plates to see which ones actually had those particular covers around their deal and everything. It was a big ruckus going on for a few days on all that, and then they wound up repealing that statute during that session and everything. But I remember that it was kind of a satisfying moment too, and because the statute was very vague, and that's why I held it was unconstitutional.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, you was before you got down there.
And talk about the lawyers that have come before your court, between 1992 and now. Have you seen their practice change in ways for good or the bad?
Yes. It's amazing. Some people, you see repeat people, and they're very good. And then sometimes you'll see somebody for the first time. It may be a newly elected DA or a lawyer fresh out of law school. And sometimes these kids that just are fairly new in their practice, they'll come in there and be as well spoken as any well seasoned attorney. And I'm never ceased to amaze that how good some of these young lawyer, both men and women, can be. And I've seen a lot more women than when I first got on the court. There weren't any women on the court when I was there, and there's been times since then that women have been a majority on our court and everything, and they do an excellent, outstanding job. And it's but it always kind of warms my heart sometimes when I look out there and I'll see somebody that I've seen for the last 20 years come, and it's hard not to, I mean, I necessarily always agree with their position, but it's not hard. It's hard to, to be real aggressive on trying to grill them as to their point and stuff. So.
And when it comes to the art of persuading judges, whether written or oral, what do you see the lawyers in your court do really, really well, and what do you see them still struggle with at times?
Well, some of them try to turn oral argument into a jury argument, and sometimes that's persuasive, it's not. We try to narrow down the issue pretty tightly, so you basically they should really argue the law, but a lot of times it's their duty to try to get us to change the law and stuff. And so that's the most interesting part, is when they're saying, y'all have ruled this way forever, but this is what times are changing, and sex registration things or a lot of different things, they're asking us to be and particularly in the death penalty stuff, where we had issues having to do with juvenile offenders in capital murder cases, or whether if you're retardation, how is that to be handled now, as far as as far as implementing the death penalty and stuff. So, yeah, that's the best part is having them try to persuade us to expand our horizons on certain things.
Yeah, and it sounds like the oral argument does play from case to case a pretty significant part.
I love oral argument.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of times I'll go into oral argument thinking the case should go this way, and then a lot of times after one party's argued, then the other party gets up, and then I felt very sympathetic towards the first lawyer's argument. And then by the time the second one argued, I'm saying, oh no, I'm thinking the other way around. And so I love oral argument, and I think it's very helpful and everything. And if and there's been times when I've been the presiding judge just because our presiding judge isn't there, and then so that's always enjoyable because I like to move along and get them going into instead of us just sitting there just trying to debate a fairly esoteric point, and so that's always been interesting.
Very good. I guess what would you say to someone who's, whether they're starting out their career, they're in the middle of it, who wants to excel in appellate advocacy or even become a judge someday? Do you have advice for them, having sat on the bench for as long as you have?
Well, if there's all aspects of being a judge that the practice of law entails. Obviously, you want to do the appellate, then I would concentrate as much as I can on those particular aspects to get as much experience in that way. And then if you want to be a trial judge, get in as much trial work as you can, so that how you really need to handle those objections and all that stuff. I've always thought that judges should be board certified, and that's something that I decided to do years ago, and got board certified both in criminal and criminal appellate law. And so I've always thought, and you only get that way, with doing as much experience as you can in order to get qualified to take the exam and stuff. So I would do as much as you can to get certified, and then if you want to be a judge, then unfortunately you still have to be somewhat aligned with some political situations, but that's kind of shifting. I think it's not shifting as much right now, but it will sooner or later.
Very good. Well, Judge, I appreciate your time today, and
once again, I'm honored, and you couldn't have been a better host. So I very much appreciate you and inviting me to do this.
Thanks, Judge.
All right, thank you, Andrew.
All right.